The old bus rattled to a stop at Maple Street, and Margaret Chen climbed down the steps carefully, gripping the handrail. Her knees weren't what they used to be, especially after working the night shift at County General Hospital. 6 hours of mopping floors and cleaning bathrooms had left her body aching. But she couldn't go home yet. Not on a Sunday morning. Sundays were special. She pulled her thin jacket tighter against the October wind and started walking toward Oakwood Cemetery. The flowers in her hand were simple daisies from the corner store, nothing fancy. They'd cost her $3, which was $3 she probably shouldn't have spent. But some things mattered more than money. The cemetery gates were always open at dawn. Margaret liked it that way. She could visit before the place filled up with other people, before she had to see families gathered around fresh graves, crying and holding each other. Those scenes reminded her too much of 3 years ago, and even now the memory could knock the breath right out of her chest. She followed the familiar path through the rows of headstones. After coming here every Sunday for 3 years, she knew the way by heart. Past the old oak tree with the broken branch, left at the angel statue with the chipped wing, straight ahead until she reached the section where newer graves sat under younger trees that hadn't grown tall enough to provide much shade yet. And there it was, the gray granite headstone with simple lettering. Emily Harrison, 1985-2022, beloved wife and friend. Margaret stood there for a moment like she always did, just looking at the name. She'd never met Emily Harrison, never shook her hand or heard her voice except for that one time. But in some strange way, Emily felt like the closest friend Margaret had in this world. She knelt down slowly, her knees creaking in protest, and cleared away the dried daisies from last week. The groundskeeper, old Mr. Peterson, always left them there until she came back with fresh ones. He told her once that he admired her dedication. Most people stopped visiting graves after a few months. Margaret had been coming for 3 years without missing a single Sunday. She arranged the new daisies in the small metal vase attached to the headstone, taking her time to make sure they looked nice. Emily deserved nice things. Emily deserved so much more than these cheap flowers, but it was all Margaret could afford. "Hello, Emily," Margaret said softly, settling back on her heels. "It's me again." Talking to a grave probably seemed crazy to most people, but Margaret didn't care. This was her time, her ritual, and nobody was around to judge her anyway. "I worked a double shift this week," she continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "Thursday and Friday both. Mrs. Liu called in sick, so they asked if I could cover. I said yes, of course. I always say yes. The money helps, even though my feet felt like they were on fire by the end of it." A bird chirped somewhere in the trees above, and Margaret glanced up, watching it hop from branch to branch. "I'm getting closer, though," she said, looking back at the headstone. "To my goal, I mean. I've got almost $2,000 saved now. Can you believe it? $2,000. I know that probably doesn't sound like much to some people, but for me it's everything. Another year, maybe less, and I'll have enough for a proper headstone, a real one, with her name carved deep and beautiful with flowers etched around the edges. Nothing fancy, but something that says she mattered. Because she did matter, Emily. She mattered so much." The wind picked up, rustling the leaves and making the daisies sway. Margaret pulled her jacket tighter. "I saw a girl at the hospital yesterday who reminded me of her," she said, and now her voice cracked just a little.
"Same age she would have been."
23, maybe 24. She was visiting someone, and she had this laugh that just filled up the whole hallway, loud and bright and full of life. And for just a second I let myself imagine that's what she would have sounded like if she'd gotten better, if things had been different. Margaret closed her eyes, fighting back the tears that always threatened to come during these visits. After 3 years you'd think it would get easier, but grief didn't work that way. Some days were better than others, but the pain never fully went away. It just learned to live inside you, quiet most of the time, but always there. "I still think about that night," Margaret whispered, "the night she died. I wasn't there, Emily. I wasn't there when she needed me most. I was here in this city working my shift because we needed the money for the medical bills. The hospital was 3 hours away, and by the time they called me, by the time I could get someone to cover my shift and find a ride, it was too late. She was already gone." A tear rolled down Margaret's cheek and she wiped it away quickly. "But you were there," she said, and now her voice was steadier, filled with gratitude. "You held her hand. The other nurses told me that when I finally arrived. They said a nurse named Emily stayed with her in those final hours. They said you talked to her, held her hand, made sure she wasn't alone. You did what I couldn't do, Emily. You gave her comfort when her own mother couldn't be there." Margaret reached out and touched the cold granite of the headstone, tracing the letters of Emily's name with her finger. "I found your name tag in her room," she continued. "After everything was over, after I'd said goodbye and they'd taken her away, I was packing up her things. There wasn't much. Just some clothes, a few books, her phone. And then I found it under the bed like it had fallen there. Emily Harrison, RN. I held on to it for weeks, carrying it in my pocket. I wanted to thank you, to tell you what your kindness meant. But when I finally worked up the courage to go back to that hospital and ask for you, they told me you'd died. Just 2 weeks after my daughter. An aneurysm, they said, sudden, no warning. Here one day, gone the next." The bird in the tree above sang again, a long melodic trill that sounded almost like a question. "So I found your grave instead," Margaret said. "I called the hospital, asked where you'd been buried, and I came here. I needed to thank you, even if you couldn't hear me. I needed to tell you that what you did mattered, that you made a difference in the last hours of my daughter's life, and that means everything to a mother's heart." She sat down fully now, not caring that the damp grass would soak through her work pants. She was tired, so tired, not just from the double shifts and the early morning bus rides, but from carrying the weight of loss for 3 years. It was exhausting, this grief. It never took a day off. "I got a letter from the landlord this week," Margaret said, changing the subject like she always did during these visits. She'd share her pain, then her daily life, treating Emily's grave like a friend who wanted to hear everything. "They're raising the rent again. $50 more a month. I don't know how they expect people to keep up. Everything costs more now. Food, rent, bus fare, everything. I'm working 2 jobs already and I'm 62 years old. How many more jobs can I get?" She laughed, but it was a tired sound, empty of real humor. "I shouldn't complain," she said quickly. "I have my health mostly. I have a roof over my head. I have work. That's more than a lot of people can say. I just get tired sometimes, you know? Tired of always counting pennies. Tired of choosing between buying medicine and buying decent food. Tired of wearing shoes with holes in them because new ones aren't in the budget." Margaret looked down at her feet, at the worn sneakers that had seen better days. "But I keep going," she said firmly. "Because that's what we do, right? We keep going. We put one foot in front of the other. We show up for our shifts. We pay our bills. We survive. And some weeks, if we're lucky, we even manage to save $3 for flowers." She smiled then, a real smile, small but genuine. "You know what's funny?" Margaret said. "Coming here, talking to you like this, it's become the best part of my week. Is that strange? I think some people would say it's strange. But you don't judge me, Emily. You don't tell me I'm too old to be working night shifts or too poor to be wasting money on flowers. You just listen, or at least I like to think you listen. Maybe that's all any of us really need. Someone who listens without judging. Someone who cares without expecting anything back." In the distance, Margaret heard voices. Other visitors arriving, early morning mourners come to tend their own graves. She didn't have much time left before she needed to catch the next bus to her other job at Morrison's Diner downtown. "I should go," she said, getting to her feet with some effort. "My shift starts at 9 and you know how Mr. Morrison gets when people are late. But I'll be back next Sunday, same as always. I'll bring more daisies. Maybe yellow ones this time, if they have them at the store. You'd like yellow, I think. They're cheerful." She stood there for another moment, looking at the headstone, at the name carved into stone, at the dates that marked a life cut too short. "Thank you, Emily," Margaret whispered. "Thank you for being there when I couldn't be. Thank you for showing kindness to a scared young woman who died far from home. Thank you for holding her hand. I hope wherever you are, someone's holding your hand too. I hope you know that you mattered, that you still matter. That every Sunday a tired old cleaning woman comes here and remembers the good you did." She turned to leave, then paused and looked back. "And I hope you don't mind me visiting like this," she added. "I hope you don't mind me treating your resting place like my own private sanctuary. It's become that for me, you know, a place where I can be honest. A place where I can remember. A place where 2 mothers who never met can somehow understand each other across the divide between life and death." Margaret walked away slowly, following the path back through the cemetery. Mr. Peterson was trimming hedges near the entrance and he waved at her. She waved back, managing a small smile. "Same time next week, Mrs. Chen?" he called out. "Same time next week," she confirmed. As she walked through the cemetery gates and back toward the bus stop, Margaret didn't notice the black car parked across the street. She didn't see the man sitting in the driver's seat watching her leave. She didn't know that someone else had been visiting Oakwood Cemetery that morning too. Someone who had seen her kneeling at Emily Harrison's grave. Someone who had questions about the woman who came every Sunday with daisies. Margaret just walked on, thinking about her next shift, about the rent increase, about how she'd make it all work somehow. She always did. Behind her at the grave, the fresh daisies swayed in the October wind, bright and simple and sincere, just like the love that had brought them there. The next Sunday came cold and gray, with clouds hanging low over the city like a heavy blanket. Margaret almost stayed home. Her back was hurting worse than usual, and the thought of walking through a chilly cemetery wasn't appealing. But she'd made a promise to herself 3 years ago. Rain or shine, hot or cold, she would visit Emily's grave every Sunday. She wasn't about to break that promise now. She bought the daisies from the same corner store, yellow ones this time like she'd mentioned. The teenager at the counter looked half asleep, barely glancing at her as he took her money. Margaret didn't mind. She was invisible to most people these days. Old women who cleaned floors for a living tended to blend into the background of other people's lives. The bus was more crowded than usual. Margaret had to stand holding onto the overhead rail while the bus lurched and swayed through the streets. Her knees protested with every sharp turn, but she held on tight. Just 20 more minutes and she'd be at the cemetery. Just 20 more minutes and she could sit on the bench near Emily's grave and have her weekly conversation in peace. When she finally reached Oakwood Cemetery, she noticed something different right away. There was a car in the parking lot. A nice car, the kind with a shine that came from regular washing and careful maintenance. It was unusual to see expensive cars here this early on a Sunday morning. Most visitors came in the afternoon after church or brunch. The early morning hours belonged to people like Margaret, the ones who had to fit their grief in between work shifts. She thought nothing more of it and walked her usual path. Past the oak tree left at the angel statue, straight ahead to Emily's section. But as she got closer, her steps slowed. There was someone already at Emily's grave. A man, tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a long dark coat that probably cost more than Margaret made in 3 months. He was standing perfectly still, holding a bouquet of white roses. Margaret's heart sank. She felt like an intruder suddenly, like she'd been caught doing something wrong. This was probably Emily's husband, or her father, someone who actually knew her, who had a real right to be here, not like Margaret, a stranger who'd latched onto a dead woman's memory because of one act of kindness. She started to turn away, thinking she'd come back later. But her shoes crunched on the gravel path and the man's head turned. He looked at her and Margaret froze. There was something in his eyes, a deep sadness that she recognized immediately. It was the same look she saw in her own mirror every morning. "I'm sorry," Margaret said quickly, holding up her yellow daisies like evidence of her intentions. "I didn't mean to intrude. I can come back later." The man blinked, seeming to come back to himself from wherever his thoughts had taken him. "No, please," he said, and his voice was rough, like he hadn't used it much lately. "Don't leave on my account. Were you coming to visit Emily?" Margaret nodded, unsure what else to do. She felt awkward standing there with her cheap flowers while this well-dressed man held roses that probably cost $50. "How did you know her?" the man asked, and there was genuine curiosity in his voice, not suspicion or anger. Margaret's throat felt tight. "I didn't really," she admitted. "Not personally, but she helped my daughter. 3 years ago at County General, my daughter was very sick and Emily was her nurse. She was there at the end when I couldn't be." The man's expression changed. His eyes widened slightly and he took a step closer. "Your daughter," he said slowly. "What was her name?" "Lily," Margaret whispered. "Lily Chen. She was 21 when she passed." Something crossed the man's face then, recognition mixed with pain. "Lily," he repeated. "Emily talked about a Lily. She came home one night about 3 years ago and she was crying. She told me about a young woman at the hospital who died, and how the mother couldn't get there in time because she was working. She was heartbroken about it. She said she'd held the girl's hand and talked to her about anything and everything just so she wouldn't be alone." Margaret's eyes filled with tears. She'd imagined this moment before, wondered what Emily might have said about Lily, but hearing it confirmed was almost too much. "That was my Lily," she managed to say, "and I was the mother who wasn't there. I was here in the city. working my shift at the hospital because we needed the money for her medical bills. By the time I got to her, she was already gone. The man set his roses down carefully on the grave and turned to face Margaret fully. "I'm David Harrison," he said. "Emily's husband." Margaret felt her knees go weak. She'd known, of course, but hearing it confirmed made it all real. "I'm so sorry for your loss," she said, "because what else could you say? Emily was a wonderful person. What she did for Lily, staying with her, comforting her, it meant everything to me. I came here to thank her, to tell her that. And then I just kept coming." David looked at her for a long moment, and Margaret couldn't quite read his expression. "How often do you come here?" he asked. "Every Sunday," Margaret admitted. "For 3 years now. I bring flowers and I talk to her. I know that probably sounds strange." "It doesn't sound strange at all," David said quietly. "I come every 3 months. I live on the East Coast now in Boston. I moved there after Emily died because I couldn't stay in this city anymore. Everything here reminded me of her, but every 3 months I fly back and visit her grave. 3 months feels like forever, but coming more often feels like it would break me." They stood there in silence for a moment, two strangers united by grief and by the memory of a woman who'd touched both their lives. "Would you mind if I stayed?" Margaret asked hesitantly. "While you visit? I can wait on the bench over there." "Actually," David said, and there was something almost desperate in his voice, "would you mind staying here, talking to me about Emily? I realize we just met, but you're the first person I've encountered who visits her grave. The first person who seems to remember her the way I do." Margaret was surprised, but she nodded. "Of course. I'd be honored." They both knelt down, Margaret with her yellow daisies and David with his white roses, and arranged the flowers on either side of the headstone. It looked beautiful, Margaret thought, the yellow and white together. "Like sunshine and clouds." She loved yellow, David said, noticing the daisies. Yellow was her favorite color. She said it reminded her of hope. Margaret smiled through her tears. "I didn't know that. I just thought they looked cheerful." "They do," David agreed. She would have liked them. They moved to the bench nearby, sitting down with a careful distance between them. David looked exhausted up close, Margaret noticed. There were dark circles under his eyes and lines on his face that spoke of sleepless nights and heavy burdens. "Tell me about Lily," David said, "if you don't mind." Emily thought about her for months afterward. "I'd like to know more about the young woman who affected my wife so deeply." So Margaret told him. She told him about Lily's laugh, which could light up a whole room. About how Lily had loved to paint, even though they'd never had money for proper art supplies. About how Lily had worked 2 jobs while going to community college, because she'd been determined to be the first person in their family to get a degree. About how the sickness had come suddenly, aggressively, and how the medical bills had piled up faster than Margaret could pay them even with her 2 jobs. "She was so brave," Margaret said, her voice breaking. "Even when she was sick, even when she was in pain, she kept telling me everything would be okay. She kept worrying about me instead of herself. That last day when they called to tell me to come quickly, she'd asked for me. She wanted her mother, and I wasn't there. But Emily was," David said gently. "Emily was there, and she made sure Lily wasn't alone. That's who Emily was. She couldn't stand the thought of anyone suffering alone. It's what made her such a good nurse, but it's also what wore her down. She carried everyone's pain with her." Margaret looked at him. "How did she die?" "If you don't mind me asking." "The nurses at the hospital just said it was sudden." David's face tightened. "An aneurysm. She was at work, finishing up a shift, and she collapsed. They rushed her into surgery, but there was nothing they could do. She was 37 years old. We'd been married for 15 years. We were supposed to have 40 more. I'm so sorry," Margaret whispered. "The worst part," David continued, and now his voice was shaking, "is that I never got to say goodbye. I was traveling for work on a business trip to Seattle. By the time I got the call and flew back, she was already gone. Just like your Lily. We both loved someone who died without us there to hold their hand." Margaret reached out instinctively and placed her hand on David's arm. It was a bold gesture for her, touching a stranger. But grief had a way of breaking down the normal walls between people. "They knew we loved them," she said firmly. "Both of them knew. Love doesn't need to be in the room to be felt. It exists beyond physical presence. Lily knew I loved her with everything in me, just like Emily knew you loved her." David looked at Margaret's weathered hand on his expensive coat sleeve, and something in his expression softened. "Thank you," he said. "I needed to hear that." They sat in silence for a while, watching the wind move through the trees. A few other visitors had arrived now, scattered throughout the cemetery, tending to their own losses. "Can I ask you something?" David said finally. "Why do you come every week?" "I'm not judging, I'm genuinely curious. Emily was Lily's nurse for what, a few days? Maybe a week?" Margaret thought about how to explain it. 4 days, she said. Lily was in that hospital for 4 days before she died. And you're right, it's not like Emily and I were friends. We never even met, really, not properly. But she did something for me that I can never repay. She gave my daughter comfort in her darkest hour. She held her hand when I couldn't. And in doing that, she gave me a gift too. Because now, when I think about Lily's last moments, I don't just see her alone and scared. I see her with someone kind, someone who cared. That image, that knowledge, it's what allows me to sleep at night. She paused, wiping at her eyes. And coming here, talking to Emily, it helps me feel connected to Lily somehow. Like by honoring the person who helped her, I'm still taking care of my daughter in some small way. Does that make sense? David nodded slowly. It makes perfect sense. More sense than you might realize. There was something in his tone, something Margaret couldn't quite identify. She glanced at him, and he was staring at Emily's grave with an intensity that made her uncomfortable. "I should tell you something," David said, and now he sounded nervous. "Something you deserve to know." Margaret's stomach tightened. "What is it?" David took a deep breath. "I've seen you before. Here at the cemetery. Multiple times." Margaret frowned, confused. "But you said you only come every 3 months." "That's true," David said. "But the cemetery has security cameras. They were installed 2 years ago after some vandalism. The footage is stored digitally, and the cemetery director is an old friend of mine. After Emily died, I was in a very dark place. I started drinking heavily, letting my business fall apart. I couldn't function. And one night, about 18 months ago, I was at my lowest point. I was sitting in my hotel room with a bottle, and I was thinking that I couldn't do this anymore, that I couldn't keep living without her." Margaret listened, her heart aching for this man's pain. "I called the cemetery director, Tom, just to talk. I was drunk and rambling about how nobody remembered Emily, how everyone had moved on with their lives like she'd never existed. And Tom told me something that changed everything. He told me about you. About a woman who came every single Sunday to leave flowers on Emily's grave. A woman who talked to the headstone like she was talking to an old friend. He offered to show me the security footage, and I said yes." Margaret felt a chill run down her spine. "You've been watching me?" "Not in a creepy way," David said quickly. "I promise. I just watched the footage from that one day and then maybe a few more times. Seeing you there, seeing how faithful you were, seeing how much you obviously cared about Emily's memory, it did something to me. It reminded me that Emily's life had meant something, that the kindness she'd shown to your daughter had created this ripple effect that was still going. It sounds crazy, but watching you visit her grave gave me a reason to stay alive." Margaret didn't know what to say. She felt violated and touched at the same time, angry and sympathetic. "I stopped drinking that night," David continued. "I went to my first AA meeting the next day. I started therapy. I rebuilt my relationship with my company, with my employees. I started living again instead of just existing. And it was because of you, Margaret. Because seeing your dedication to Emily's memory reminded me that love doesn't die when people do. It continues. It transforms. It becomes something new." A tear rolled down Margaret's cheek. "I don't know if I should be upset or grateful that you were watching me." "Be upset," David said. "You have every right to be. It was an invasion of your privacy, even if my intentions were good. I'm telling you now because I couldn't stand the thought of having this secret between us. Not when we're both here, mourning the same person, connected by the same loss." Margaret looked at Emily's grave, at the yellow daisies and white roses lying side by side. "Emily would want us to forgive each other," she said finally. "She was kind to my daughter when she didn't have to be. The least I can do is extend that same kindness to her husband." David let out a breath he seemed to have been holding. "Thank you." They sat together for a while longer, two people who'd been strangers an hour ago but who now shared something deeper than most friendships. Eventually, Margaret had to check her watch. "I need to go," she said reluctantly. "My shift at the diner starts soon." David stood when she did. "Can I give you a ride?" "My car's in the parking lot." Margaret hesitated. She didn't usually accept rides from strangers. even well-dressed ones who'd just poured their heart out to her. But something about David felt safe. Maybe it was their shared grief. Maybe it was the fact that they'd both loved Emily in different ways. "Okay," she said. "Thank you." As they walked toward the parking lot together, Margaret glanced back at Emily's grave one more time. The flowers looked beautiful there, yellow and white, sunshine and hope. And for the first time in 3 years, Margaret didn't feel quite so alone in her grief. She had no idea that this chance meeting was about to change her entire life. The ride to Morrison's diner should have been awkward. Margaret sitting in a car that probably cost more than she'd earned in the past 5 years, with a man she'd just met, heading to her waitressing job in the part of town where luxury cars didn't usually venture. But somehow it wasn't awkward at all. David drove carefully, asking her questions about her life and actually listening to the answers like they mattered. "How long have you been working at the diner?" he asked, navigating through the Sunday morning traffic. 8 years now," Margaret said, watching the familiar streets pass by. "I started there after Lily got sick. Needed the extra income for the medical bills. I thought I'd quit once the bills were paid off, but then she died and I still had funeral expenses. And then I just never left. The money helps and it keeps me busy." "2 jobs must be exhausting," David said. Margaret shrugged. "You do what you have to do. Besides, what else would I do with my time? Sit in my apartment and feel sorry for myself? At least when I'm working, I'm useful. I'm doing something." David pulled up in front of Morrison's diner, a place that had seen better days probably 30 years ago. The neon sign flickered and the paint on the building was peeling, but it was clean inside and the food was decent. Margaret had her hand on the door handle when David spoke again. "Margaret, can I ask you something?" She turned back to look at him. "Sure. Would you mind if I stayed in touch? Maybe met for coffee sometime? I'd like to hear more about Lily, and about your visits to Emily's grave. I don't have many people I can talk to about her anymore. Everyone back in Boston thinks I should move on, get back to normal. But they don't understand that Emily was my normal." Margaret felt a warmth spread through her chest. "I'd like that," she said. "I'd like that very much. I don't have many people to talk to either. Most of my old friends drifted away after Lily died. I think my grief made them uncomfortable." They exchanged phone numbers, David typing Margaret's into his expensive smartphone, while Margaret carefully wrote his on a napkin from her purse. Then she thanked him for the ride and headed into the diner, feeling lighter than she had in months. The next 2 weeks passed normally. Margaret worked her shifts, visited Emily's grave on Sunday, and went about her quiet life. She thought about David sometimes, wondered if he'd actually call or if their meeting had been just a moment in time, meaningful but temporary. She wouldn't have blamed him if he didn't reach out. Rich executives didn't usually maintain friendships with elderly cleaning women. But then, on a Wednesday evening when Margaret was getting ready for her night shift at the hospital, there was a knock on her apartment door. She wasn't expecting anyone. Her landlord had already collected rent and she didn't have friends who dropped by unannounced. She opened the door cautiously, leaving the chain lock on, and nearly gasped. David Harrison stood in her dingy hallway, looking completely out of place in his business suit among the peeling wallpaper and flickering fluorescent lights. "David, what are you doing here?" He looked nervous, she realized. This confident CEO looked genuinely nervous standing at her door. "I'm sorry to just show up like this," he said. "I tried calling, but the number you gave me isn't working. I think maybe you wrote it down wrong." Margaret felt her face flush with embarrassment. Her eyesight wasn't what it used to be, and she'd probably switched 2 numbers around. "I'm so sorry. I didn't realize." "It's okay," David said quickly. "I asked Tom, the cemetery director, if he had your contact information. He gave me your address. I hope that's not too intrusive." Margaret unhooked the chain and opened the door wider. "No, it's fine. Do you want to come in? I have to warn you, it's not much." David stepped inside and Margaret saw her tiny studio apartment through his eyes. The single room that served as bedroom, living room, and kitchen. The old furniture she'd had for 20 years. The water stain on the ceiling that the landlord kept promising to fix. The hot plate because the stove had broken months ago and she couldn't afford to replace it. "Can I get you something to drink?" she asked, trying to maintain some dignity. "I have water, or I think there's some tea somewhere." "I'm fine, thank you," David said, but he wasn't looking at her. He was looking around the apartment with an expression Margaret couldn't quite read. "I know it's not much," she said defensively, "but it's clean, and the rent is cheaper than most places in the city." That's not what I was thinking, David said, turning to face her. I was thinking that this isn't right. That someone who visits my wife's grave every week with flowers, who works 2 jobs just to survive, shouldn't be living like this. Not in a city where people like me have 3 homes we barely use. Margaret stiffened. I don't need your pity, David. I'm doing fine. I pay my bills. I take care of myself. It's not pity, David said, and there was something urgent in his voice. Margaret, please sit down. I came here because I have something to ask you, and I need you to hear me out before you say no. Reluctantly, Margaret sat on her worn couch. David remained standing, pacing slightly like he was trying to figure out how to say something difficult. Before Emily died, he began, she was working on a project, a program she wanted to implement at the hospital. She'd seen too many families fall apart under the weight of medical crises, people losing their homes because they couldn't work while taking care of sick relatives, parents choosing between buying medicine and buying food. She wanted to create a support system, something that would help families navigate the medical system and connect them with resources. Financial assistance, counseling, practical support, all of it. Margaret listened, wondering where this was going. She had plans drawn up, proposals written, partnerships lined up with social workers and financial advisors. But then she died and the project died with her. I couldn't look at it for 2 years. It hurt too much. But lately I've been thinking about it again, about how Emily would want her work to continue, about how many families are out there right now struggling the way you struggled. He stopped pacing and looked directly at Margaret. I want to start the program. I want to fund it entirely, create it as a memorial to Emily. But here's the thing, I can't do it alone. I'm a businessman. I understand money and logistics and management, but I don't understand what it's like to be on the other side. I don't know what families actually need because I've never been there. I've never had to choose between rent and medicine. I've never had to work 3 jobs just to keep the lights on. Margaret's heart started beating faster. She had a feeling she knew what was coming, and it terrified her. I need someone who understands, David continued. Someone who's lived through it. Someone who knows what questions to ask and what help matters most. Someone who cares about people the way Emily did. I need you, Margaret. There it was. The offer she'd been both hoping for and dreading. I want you to run the program, David said. I want you to be the director of the Emily Harrison Family Support Initiative. You'd work with social workers and counselors, but you'd be the one making the decisions about how we help people. You'd be the heart of the whole operation. Margaret felt dizzy. David, I'm a cleaning woman. I didn't even finish high school. I don't have any qualifications for something like that. You have the only qualification that matters, David said firmly. You've lived it. You know what it's like to sit in a hospital waiting room at 2 a.m, terrified and alone. You know what it's like to open a medical bill and feel your heart sink because there's no way you can pay it. You know what matters because you've needed those things yourself. But running a program working with professionals, I wouldn't know what to do. I'd embarrass you. I'd embarrass myself. David sat down on the couch beside her, careful to maintain a respectful distance. Margaret, do you know what my company does? We make medical technology. Devices that cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. And do you know who's been making the real decisions for the past 15 years? Not me. Emily. She'd tell me which projects mattered, which ones would actually help patients instead of just making money. She didn't have a business degree. She had something better. She had empathy and experience and common sense. Just like you. Margaret shook her head, overwhelmed. I can't. David, I appreciate the offer, I really do. But I can't take charity. I've worked my whole life, paid my own way. I can't just take a job I'm not qualified for because you feel bad for me. This isn't charity, David said, and now there was frustration in his voice. This is a real job with real responsibilities. You'd be working full-time, probably more than full-time at first. You'd be dealing with difficult situations and making hard decisions. The salary would be $60,000 a year to start, with full benefits. That's not charity, Margaret. That's less than I'd pay someone with a degree and no experience. You'd actually be a bargain. $60,000. Margaret tried to wrap her mind around the number. She currently made maybe $25,000 a year working 2 jobs. $60,000 was more than double that. It was enough to move to a better apartment, to stop working night shifts, to maybe even have health insurance that actually covered things. I need to think about it, she whispered. Of course, David said. Take all the time you need. But Margaret, please really consider it. Not just for yourself, but for all the families out there who are where you were 3 years ago. You could help them. You could be the person for them that you wished someone had been for you. After David left, Margaret sat on her couch for a long time, staring at the business card he'd left on her coffee table. David Harrison, CEO, Harrison Medical Technologies. Below it, he'd written a phone number in pen and the words, "Call me when you're ready." She looked around her apartment at the life she'd built from nothing. She was proud of her independence, of the fact that she'd survived Lily's death and kept going, but she was also tired, so tired. And the thought of working one job instead of two, of having enough money to buy new shoes when she needed them, of helping other families avoid the pain she'd experienced, it was tempting. But doubt gnawed at her. What if she failed? What if she took the job and proved that she wasn't capable? What if David realized he'd made a mistake? The next few days were torture. Margaret couldn't stop thinking about the offer. At the hospital, while she mopped floors, she thought about it. At the diner, while she served coffee, she thought about it. At home, lying in bed unable to sleep, she thought about it. On Sunday, she went to Emily's grave as usual. She brought purple flowers this time, a mix of different types she'd splurged on from a nicer florist. She needed to talk to Emily to figure out what to do. "I don't know what to think," Margaret said, arranging the flowers carefully. "Your husband wants to give me a job, Emily. A real job, not scrubbing toilets or refilling coffee cups. A job where I could actually help people. But I'm scared. What if I'm not good enough? What if I let him down? What if I let you down?" The wind rustled through the trees and Margaret closed her eyes. "I keep thinking about what you would want," she continued. "You gave everything to help people. You stayed late with patients like Lily, holding their hands, making sure they weren't alone. You didn't do that because you had to. You did it because you cared. And David says you had this dream of helping families like mine, families struggling under the weight of medical crises." She opened her eyes and looked at Emily's name carved into the granite. "Maybe that's what I'm supposed to do," Margaret said slowly, the realization forming as she spoke. "Maybe I'm supposed to take this chance, not for myself, but for all the other mothers out there who are sitting in hospital waiting rooms right now, scared and alone. Maybe I'm supposed to be the person I needed when Lily was dying." She sat there for a while longer, letting the decision settle over her like a warm blanket. It still scared her. She still had doubts, but for the first time, she also had hope. When she got home that evening, Margaret picked up David's business card and dialed the number carefully, making sure to get every digit right this time. He answered on the second ring. "Hello?" "David, it's Margaret Chen." "Margaret, I'm glad you called." "Have you thought about my offer?" Margaret took a deep breath. "I have, and I want to do it. I want to help run Emily's program. I'm still scared that I'll mess it up, but I want to try. For Emily, for Lily, for all the families who need help." There was a pause, and then David's voice came through warm and relieved. "Thank you, Margaret. You have no idea what this means to me. When can you start?" "I need to give 2 weeks' notice at both my jobs," Margaret said. "It's only right. And I'll need help figuring out what this job actually involves. Like I said, I don't have any experience with this kind of thing." "We'll figure it out together," David promised. "I'll have my assistant send over some of Emily's original proposals so you can start familiarizing yourself with her vision. And Margaret, welcome to the team." After they hung up, Margaret sat in her small apartment feeling like her life had just shifted on its axis. She was terrified and excited and grateful all at once. She thought about Lily, about whether her daughter would be proud of her for taking this chance. She thought about Emily, about the nurse who'd held a dying girl's hand and changed 2 lives in ways she'd never know. And she thought about the future, about the families she might be able to help, about the difference one person could make if they were brave enough to try. For the first time in 3 years, Margaret Chen felt like her life was beginning again. Margaret's first day at Harrison Medical Technologies was nothing like she'd imagined. She'd expected a small office, maybe a desk in a corner somewhere. Instead, David showed her to a spacious room on the 3rd floor with windows overlooking the city, a proper desk with a computer, and a couch for meetings. There was even a small refrigerator stocked with water and healthy snacks. "This is too much," Margaret said, standing in the doorway and feeling completely out of place in her best outfit, which was really just a clean pair of slacks and a blouse she'd bought from a thrift store 5 years ago. "It's exactly enough," David replied. "You're going to be meeting with families here, Margaret. People who are going through the worst time of their lives. They need to feel comfortable, not like they're sitting in some cramped closet begging for help. He had a point, but Margaret still felt like an imposter. Everyone else in the building wore expensive clothes and carried themselves with confidence. She was just a cleaning woman playing dress-up. The first week was overwhelming. David had hired a young social worker named Amy to help Margaret get started. Amy was fresh out of graduate school, full of energy and ideas. And at first Margaret was intimidated by her education and enthusiasm. But Amy turned out to be kind and patient, never making Margaret feel stupid for asking basic questions. "So this is Emily's original proposal," Amy explained, spreading documents across Margaret's new desk. She wanted to create a three-part system. First, immediate crisis intervention for families facing medical emergencies, things like emergency funds for rent or utilities, temporary housing if needed, help with transportation to and from the hospital. Second, ongoing case management to help families navigate insurance, apply for assistance programs, and connect with community resources. Third, emotional support through counseling and support groups. Margaret studied the documents, recognizing Emily's handwriting in the margins. Notes like, "Remember the Johnsons" and "Ask about childcare needs" showed how deeply Emily had thought about real families, not just abstract concepts. "It's brilliant," Margaret said quietly. "She thought of everything. Almost everything," Amy said gently. "But that's where you come in. You've lived through what these families are experiencing. You'll see gaps that Emily might have missed, no matter how thoughtful she was." The next few weeks were a blur of meetings, planning sessions, and paperwork. David brought in lawyers to set up the foundation properly, accountants to manage the funds, and consultants to help design the programs. Margaret felt lost in most of these meetings, surrounded by people using words she didn't understand and making references to policies she'd never heard of. But then something shifted. They were in a meeting about intake procedures, discussing how families would apply for help, when one of the consultants suggested a lengthy application process with multiple verification steps. "We need to prevent fraud," the consultant said. "Make sure the people applying actually need help and aren't taking advantage of the system." Margaret had been quiet through most of the meeting, but something about that comment made her speak up. "Have you ever been poor?" she asked the consultant, her voice steady but firm. The woman blinked, clearly taken aback. "Excuse me? Have you ever been in a position where you needed help? Where you had to ask strangers for money because you couldn't feed your kids or pay your rent?" "Well, no, but that's not really relevant to—" "It's completely relevant," Margaret interrupted, and she felt David's eyes on her, encouraging. "Because if you had been there, you'd know that the application process you're describing would take weeks. Weeks of gathering documents, making copies, filling out forms, waiting for approval. And in those weeks, people lose their apartments. Their electricity gets shut off. They miss work because they can't afford gas to get there. The help becomes useless because it comes too late." The room had gone quiet. Margaret felt her face flush, worried she'd overstepped, but she kept going. "When Lily was dying, I tried to apply for assistance programs. Do you know what they asked me for? Pay stubs from the last 3 months, bank statements, proof of residence, medical records, tax returns. I was working 2 jobs and spending every free moment at the hospital. I didn't have time to gather all those documents. I didn't have time to make copies and mail them in and wait for responses. I needed help right then, in that moment. And by the time I could jump through all their hoops, it was too late." Amy was nodding vigorously. David had a small smile on his face. The consultant looked uncomfortable. "So what would you suggest?" David asked Margaret. Margaret took a deep breath. "We trust people. We start with trust instead of suspicion. If someone calls us and says they need help, we believe them and we act fast. We can verify things later if we need to. But the immediate crisis gets addressed immediately. A same-day emergency fund for rent or utilities. Gas cards handed out on the spot. Whatever gets them through the current emergency. Everything else can wait." The consultant started to object, but David held up his hand. "Margaret's right. This foundation exists because my wife believed in helping people, not in creating bureaucratic obstacles. We'll do it Margaret's way." After that meeting, something changed in how people treated Margaret. They started actually listening to her ideas instead of just nodding politely. Amy began running suggestions by her before presenting them to the larger group. Even the lawyers started asking her opinion on how to word things so families would actually understand them. But the real test came 6 weeks into Margaret's new job. They'd just officially opened the Emily Harrison Family Support Initiative, and they got their first call. A woman named Rosa, whose husband had been in a terrible accident. He was in ICU, not expected to make it, and Rosa had 3 kids at home and no way to pay rent that was due in 3 days. Margaret took the call personally, her hands shaking as she picked up the phone. "This is Margaret Chen. How can I help you?" Rosa's voice was breaking, desperate. She explained the situation through tears, apologizing repeatedly for bothering anyone, saying she didn't know what else to do. "You're not bothering anyone," Margaret said firmly, her own voice steady now. "That's why we're here. Tell me what you need right now. Today." Within 2 hours, Margaret had arranged for an emergency fund transfer to cover Rosa's rent, and the next month's rent, too. She'd sent a gas card by courier so Rosa could drive to the hospital. She'd connected Rosa with a counselor who specialized in grief and trauma, and she'd arranged for a volunteer to bring groceries to Rosa's house so her kids would have food. When Margaret hung up the phone, she found David standing in her doorway. She hadn't heard him come in. "You were amazing," he said simply. Margaret wiped at her eyes. "I just kept thinking about what I wished someone had done for me. What would have made a difference when I was where Rosa is now?" "That's exactly what Emily would have done," David said. "You're perfect for this job, Margaret. I hope you're starting to see that." Over the next few months, Margaret helped dozens of families. Each one was different. Each one had unique needs, but Margaret found that her instincts were usually right. She knew when someone needed money and when they needed someone to just listen. She knew when to push for more aggressive medical advocacy and when to help families accept that it was time to let go. She knew because she'd been there. The work was emotionally exhausting. Some nights Margaret went home and cried for hours, overwhelmed by the pain she witnessed. But it was also fulfilling in a way her previous jobs had never been. She was making a real difference. She was being the person she'd needed when Lily was dying. But there was one part of her new life that nagged at her, one question she couldn't quite shake. One Sunday, after visiting Emily's grave as usual, she finally asked David about it. He'd started coming on Sundays too when he was in town, and they'd developed a routine of visiting the grave together and then getting coffee.